The golden afternoon light in the Merrick's pristine kitchen shattered the moment David's hand clamped onto his son's shoulder with a strength that turned his knuckles a ghostly white. In the basement doorway, usually a threshold of safety, David's face had transformed into a visceral, animalistic mask, his eyes burning with a cold, predatory light that Allison didn't recognize. Scattered on the floor between them were a few grainy, yellowed Polaroids and a brittle driver's license. Relics pulled from a hidden niche in the foundation that should have remained buried forever. Allison watched from the stairs, her breath hitching as she saw the sheer terror in her son's eyes and the jagged, unfamiliar rage in her husband's. As David slammed the heavy oak door and turned the deadbolt with a final, metallic screech, the silence that followed wasn't the peaceful quiet of their elite neighborhood. It was the suffocating stillness of a tomb. She looked down at the one photograph David had missed, staring at a face from 20 years ago that possessed her husband's exact, defiant brow, and realized the perfect life they had built was resting on a foundation of secrets that were finally starting to bleed. Allison Merrick glided her palm across the cool, veined surface of the Italian marble kitchen island. The stone felt like a slab of frozen history beneath her fingertips, a stark contrast to the warmth of the steam rising from her porcelain cup. The aroma of freshly ground Jamaica blue mountain beans filled the air, rich and earthy, a scent that had come to symbolize her arrival. Sunlight, soft and golden, filtered through the expansive panoramic windows of the Naperville Lane estate, illuminating a lawn so perfectly manicured it appeared painted. Allison brought the cup to her lips, catching her reflection in the polished silver of the coffee pot. She scrutinized the woman staring back, refined, poised, and utterly devoid of the exhaustion that once defined her. There were no traces left of the girl who used to count pennies at a discount supermarket register, praying the total wouldn't exceed the crumpled bills in her pocket. The silk of her robe brushed against her skin with a whisper, a tactile reminder of the cost of every square foot of this sanctuary. Allison closed her eyes, letting the rhythmic, heavy tick of the antique grandfather clock anchor her. The silence of the house was thick and luxurious, smelling of expensive French perfume and the absolute hard-won victory over the destitution of her youth. In the hallway, David Merrick adjusted the knot of his silk tie with practiced precision. He stood before the gilded mirror, checking the slope of his Armani jacket, ensuring the silhouette remained flawless. He turned as Allison approached, offering a brief, practiced kiss on her cheek that left behind a faint, sophisticated trail of sandalwood cologne. David gripped a leather briefcase embossed with gold initials, its weight suggesting the gravity of the contracts nestled within. When Leo skidded into the hall, David's face transformed into an easy, charismatic mask. He winked at the boy, radiating the effortless confidence of a man whose courtroom oratory commanded thousands of dollars an hour. Outside, the engine of the black SUV rumbled with a muted, powerful growl on the cobblestone driveway. David climbed inside, waving a hand through the tinted glass before pulling away with a smooth, silent grace. He left behind the image of an ideal patriarch, a man whose success was as visible as the white columns of their neoclassical home, the very embodiment of the American legal elite. Leo Merrick waited until the sound of the SUV faded before creeping toward the basement door. He moved on his tiptoes, his sneakers silent on the concrete stairs as he descended into the cool, dim air of the lower level. The atmosphere here was different, heavy with the scent of pine shavings and the sharp, metallic tang of machine oil from David's workbench. Leo navigated the narrow aisles between massive steel shelving units, his small frame disappearing behind stacks of overflow boxes and seasonal decor. His hand brushed against the rough grain of a back panel in a corner cabinet, and to his surprise, the wood yielded with a faint, mechanical click. Leo froze, his breath hitching as he listened to the frantic thumping of his own heart against his ribs. Slowly, the entire shelving unit groaned on hidden rollers, swinging outward to reveal a dark, recessed niche carved into the foundation. Leo squinted into the gloom, spotting a rectangular shape shrouded in tattered blueprints and gray, dust-laden rags. Reaching into the shadows, Leo's fingers closed around a tin box, its red paint flaking away in dry scales. The lid resisted at first, then gave way with a piercing, metallic screech that seemed to echo through the empty basement. Inside, he found a stack of yellowed Polaroid photographs. Leo flipped through them, his brow furrowing as he studied the images of a younger man with sharp, predatory features and a jagged scar cutting through one eyebrow. Beneath the photos lay a bundle of official-looking forms and a driver's license encased in brittle plastic. Leo's thumb traced the embossed lettering on the ID, reading the name aloud in a whisper. Marcus Thorne. He stared at the face on the documents, a cold shiver racing down his spine. The man in the photos possessed a familiar intensity, a specific way of holding his jaw that felt hauntingly recognizable. Leo couldn't understand why these remnants of a stranger's life were buried so deep beneath the foundation of their perfect, sunlight-filled world. The sudden, violent screech of tires on the gravel outside made Leo jump, nearly dropping the tin box. Overhead, the heavy thud of David's footsteps resonated through the floorboards, followed by the basement door being flung open with a crash that shook the shelves. David didn't descend the stairs. He seemed to plummet down them, his face twisted into a visceral, animalistic grimace Leo had never seen. His tie was yanked loose, his breath coming in ragged, desperate gulps. David skidded to a halt near the open niche, his eyes locking onto the box in Leo's trembling hands. The warmth David usually projected vanished instantly, replaced by a gaze so icy and piercing it felt like a physical blow. The forgotten papers he had presumably returned for were ignored. David took a predatory step toward his son, his fists clenching until the knuckles turned a ghostly, bloodless white. A low, guttural growl escaped David's throat as he lunged, snatching the tin box from Leo's grip with such ferocity that several Polaroids fluttered to the floor like dying birds. David's hand clamped onto Leo's shoulder, his fingers digging into the boy's skin through the fabric of his t-shirt. David's face was a mask of crimson rage, a thick vein throbbing violently in his temple. He didn't speak. He simply shoved Leo toward the stairs, ignoring the boy's terrified, choked-back sob. Leo stumbled, his legs barely keeping pace with his father's aggressive pace as David practically hoisted him out of the workshop. The heavy oak door slammed shut inches from Leo's face, the sound a definitive, booming finality. Leo heard the sharp metallic turn of a key in the lock, followed by the heavy slide of a deadbolt, a sound that severed him from the secret his father was clearly prepared to defend at any cost. Allison rushed to the landing, pulling a shivering Leo into her arms and pressing his head against her chest. She used the hem of her silk sleeve to dab at the tears tracks on his cheeks, her eyes fixed on the locked basement door. Muffled sounds of heavy furniture being dragged across concrete echoed from below. Allison marched to the door and pounded on the wood, her voice rising in a sharp demand for an explanation for David's uncharacteristic cruelty. She shouted his name, but the only response was an oppressive, heavy silence that seemed to leak through the cracks in the doorframe. When David finally emerged minutes later, his face had been smoothed into a terrifying, stony mask. He brushed past Allison without a word, refusing to meet her gaze. He paused only long enough to throw a jagged command over his shoulder. No one was to enter the basement again. Allison stood in the hall, the warmth of the house suddenly failing her as a cold, sharp knot of suspicion began to tighten in her gut. Late that night, Allison sat in her darkened study, the only light provided by the clinical blue glow of her laptop screen. The house was silent, save for the rhythmic patter of rain against the glass. She typed a name into a secure archival database. Marcus Thorne. Her fingers, usually so steady when handling delicate historical manuscripts, danced across the keys with a frantic energy. As a professional historian, she knew how to navigate the digital graveyards where inconvenient truths were buried. She ignored the low rumble of thunder, focusing entirely on the digitized newspaper archives from 20 years ago. Her eyes scanned columns of text, skipping past social announcements and local politics until the cursor hovered over a link in the state's criminal chronicle. Allison took a deep, shaky breath, sensing that the stable, gilded life she had built on Naperville Lane was beginning to flake away like old plaster under a sledgehammer. She stared at the grainy, pixelated black and white image on the screen. The headline of the Metropolitan Gazette screamed about a daring, bloody heist involving an armored truck. Allison read the clinical report of the shootout with police and the subsequent death of the primary suspect, Marcus Thorne. In the photo accompanying the article, a young man looked back at her with the same broad set of shoulders and the distinctive, defiant arch of the eyebrows she saw every morning across the breakfast table. She scrolled down, her heart hammering against her ribs as she reached the section describing how Thorne's body had never been officially identified by kin due to a catastrophic fire following the getaway car's crash. Allison's palms grew damp, the glowing letters on the screen blurring as the sheer magnitude of the deception began to settle over her like a shroud. Allison began to lay out archival printouts on her desk, arranging them beside a leather-bound family album. She compared the scar on Marcus Thorne's temple to the faint, silvery mark David always claimed was a souvenir from a childhood fall. The dates of Thorne's disappearance from the criminal record aligned with surgical precision to the very week, with David's sudden arrival in a neighboring state, equipped with clean documents and a suspiciously large reservoir of cash. As she traced the timelines, the lives of the two men began to coil around each other, forming a single, terrifying trajectory. Allison touched her fingertip to David's face in their wedding photo, the realization hitting her with the force of a physical blow. The man she had shared a bed with for a decade, the man she trusted with her son's future, was a ghost wearing a dead man's name, concealing a past built on blood and ash behind the respectable mask of a lawyer. A sharp, insistent pounding at the massive front door made Allison jump, her heart leaping into her throat. She moved to the window, peeling back the edge of a heavy velvet curtain. Outside, standing on the porch beneath a relentless Illinois downpour, was a man in a rumpled, sodden gray trench coat. He didn't seem to care that the rain was drenching him. His entire focus was anchored to the oak doors of the mansion. Allison watched as he spat onto the pristine, expensive tile of the entryway and slammed his fist against the wood again, his voice hoarse as he bellowed David's name. The man's shouts were jagged and threatening, cutting through the rhythmic drone of the wind. Allison noticed him glancing nervously over his shoulder, checking the empty street as if he expected a witness to emerge from the storm to see him confronting the illustrious David Merrick. Allison froze when the stranger suddenly tilted his head back, his eyes locking onto the exact spot where she stood behind the curtain. His gaze was heavy, like lead, and it seemed to pierce through the glass and the fabric, pinning her in place. There was no plea for help in his expression, no shadow of doubt, only the cold, terrifying certainty of a predator that had finally cornered its prey. She saw his lips curl into a slow, jagged sneer that revealed uneven, yellowed teeth. Allison pressed her palm against her mouth to stifle a cry, her breath coming in short, shallow hitches. In that moment, the high brick walls of the Naperville Lane estate, the burgeoning bank accounts, and David's impeccable reputation felt like nothing more than a thin, brittle sheet of ice that was, even now, cracking and plunging her into a dark, freezing abyss. Days later, Allison waited until David was occupied with a tangled garden hose in the backyard before she slipped into the garage. She clicked open the glove box of his heavy SUV, her heart racing as she sifted through leather-bound manuals. Tucked behind a packet of tissues, she found a folded sheet of paper. As she smoothed it out, the sharp, chemical scent of fresh ink hit her. It was a state map, but it had been transformed into a hunting log. Thick red lines slashed across the familiar highways, connecting various rest stops and motels. Beside each mark, in David's neat, courtroom-ready script, were timestamps. 5 minutes, 40 minutes, 2 hours. Allison's eyes locked on a circled location, the Harbor View Motel, where the stranger in the gray coat had apparently stayed the longest. Her fingers trembled, crumpling the edges of the map as the truth settled in. David wasn't just aware of the man. He was actively stalking his own pursuer. The following afternoon, Allison caught a glimpse of something in her rearview mirror as she pulled out of the grocery store parking lot. A black SUV with windows so dark they looked like voids was crawling slowly through the rows of carts behind her. She pressed the accelerator, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. But the shadow stayed pinned to her, maintaining a precise distance of 2 car lengths. Panic surged as she reached the intersection of Oak Street. Allison slammed on the brakes and jerked the wheel, diving into a narrow, trash-strewn service alley. Her tires shrieked on the damp asphalt, the sound echoing off the brick walls. She sat in the darkness of the alley, her heart thumping like a trapped bird against her ribs, watching as the predatory silhouette of the black SUV roared past the entrance, drenching her car in a spray of oily, gray gutter water. The roar of a high-performance engine suddenly filled the air, a low-frequency vibration that Allison felt in her teeth. The black SUV lunged out of her blind spot, the sound of metal grinding against metal shrieking through the cabin as it slammed into the side of her sedan. The impact sent her skidding toward the concrete parapet of the bridge. Allison clawed at the steering wheel, her breath catching as her tires skipped along the very edge of the drop-off, where the river churned in a dark, violent froth below. A sudden flash of high beams blinded her, and the sound of rending iron filled her ears. Through the driver's side window, she saw nothing but the black, impenetrable wall of the other vehicle, which was deliberately squeezing her toward the abyss. She stomped on the gas, yanking the wheel hard to the left. Her car lurched forward and leveled out, leaving a long, jagged streak of paint on the bridge's safety rail. David was waiting in the study doorway, his presence a heavy weight as he watched Allison frantically try to shove the map under a pile of utility bills. His footsteps on the oak floor were slow and deliberate, sounding like the falling of a gavel. When Allison finally snapped, screaming the name Marcus Thorne directly at him, David didn't even flinch. He moved with a sudden, terrifying fluidity, pinning her against the cold wall. She could feel the heat of his breath, a sharp contrast to the ice in his eyes. His voice dropped to a low, rhythmic whisper, stripped of all the charm he used on juries. He didn't deny it. He confirmed every detail of the old heist and the encroaching threat of his former partners. Allison saw no remorse in his face, only the calculated, cold-blooded fury of a man watching his carefully constructed world begin to splinter. David's hands clamped over Allison's icy fingers, squeezing them until the circulation began to fail. He forced her to maintain eye contact, while Leo's carefree laughter drifted in from the living room, a sound that now felt like a taunt. Methodically, David began to list the consequences of the truth. The immediate loss of his law license, the seizure of every asset they owned, and a scandal so radioactive it would permanently blackball Allison from the academic world. Each word he spoke felt like a needle being driven into her skin. He painted a vivid, gruesome picture of their collective ruin, emphasizing with clinical precision that Leo's entire future, his education, his safety, his very name, now rested entirely on her silence. Allison felt the noose of his logic tightening around her throat, leaving her with no room to breathe. Within 48 hours, the house began to change. Tiny, black electronic pupils appeared in the corners of every ceiling. Allison watched from the hallway as David stood on a stepladder, meticulously threading a camera into the ornate plaster molding above the fireplace. He didn't look down as he explained that this was the only way to track the shadows from his past. On his smartphone, dozens of tiny glowing windows flickered to life, providing a 360-degree view of their bedrooms, the kitchen, and the long, silent corridors. Allison could hear the constant, rhythmic click of the system switching between observation modes. The silence of the mansion was now filled with an invisible, mechanical presence. She shivered, realizing that even in her most private moments, a cold, unblinking eye, controlled entirely by David, was watching her every move. Allison hurried to the glass front doors of Leo's school, but her path was blocked by a man in a sharp, anonymous suit. He spoke with a polite, practiced firmness, informing her that David had rescinded her authorization to pick up their son. Panic rising, Allison tried to pay for a taxi to wait for her, but the card reader emitted a sharp, mocking beep. The account had been frozen. She felt a cold sweat break across her back as she spotted Leo through a classroom window, oblivious and safe for the moment. Suddenly, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from David, containing nothing but their home address and a blunt, one-word command: return. Allison stood on the sidewalk, the realization hitting her that she had been stripped of her money, her mobility, and her ability to protect her son from the gathering storm. The heavy, rhythmic thud of the front knocker made Allison jump. When she opened the door, a detective in a rumpled jacket stood there, the smell of stale tobacco and rain clinging to him. He held out a tablet, showing a grainy still of a black SUV that had been seen circling Naperville Lane. Allison opened her mouth, the words about the map and the bridge incident nearly spilling out. But they died in her throat. Over the detective's shoulder, she saw the tiny red indicator light of a newly installed camera in the foyer glow with a steady, malevolent intensity. She felt David's gaze on her through the lens, a cold pressure on the back of her neck. The detective waited, tapping a pen against his tablet, while Allison gripped the door handle so hard her knuckles ached, fighting the desperate primal urge to scream for help. David materialized silently behind her, his hand sliding around her waist with a proprietary grip. His smile was a masterpiece of artificial warmth, as flawless as a surgical reconstruction. He handed the detective a heavy, cream-colored business card and explained in a smooth, authoritative tone that the black vehicle belonged to his private security detail. Allison stood motionless, listening to him weave a tapestry of lies so intricate it felt like reality, framing her own terror as a husband's protective care. The detective nodded, clearly swayed by the prestigious lawyer's explanation. Allison watched the man walk away, and David kept that perfect smile pinned to his face until a police cruiser disappeared. Only then did his fingers dig into her side with bruising force, a silent reminder of who truly held the reins of power in this house. Allison was reaching for a jar of peppercorns on the high kitchen shelf when her hand brushed against something cold and plastic. Tucked behind a container of sea salt was a flat, black disc, a digital recorder with a tiny, rhythmic green light, blinking like a heartbeat. She froze, her own breath sounding like a gale in the quiet room. The realization hit her with a sickening thud. Every conversation she had with Leo, every whispered phone call to a colleague, was being harvested and stored. The kitchen was silent, except for the faint, high-pitched hum of the device. Allison slowly retracted her hand, not daring to disturb the recorder. She understood then that David had transformed their sanctuary into an acoustic trap, where even a sigh or a sob was an incriminating piece of data in his growing dossier against her. At dinner, the only sound was the sharp, rhythmic screech of David's knife against his china plate as he cut into a rare steak. He didn't look up when he informed Allison that her car keys would now be kept in his personal safe. His voice was flat, devoid of the usual lawyerly cadence as he dictated the new reality. No more walks, no more trips to the university library, and no movement without his driver. Allison stared at the gold-flocked wallpaper, which now looked like the bars of a very expensive cage. The wine in her glass trembled as she gripped the stem, her knuckles white. David finished his water and offered a cold, satisfied smile, confirming without a single threat that the Naperville Lane estate had officially become the most luxurious prison in the state of Illinois. Allison stood at the second-floor window, her forehead pressed against the cool glass as she watched the driveway. In the pale, flickering light of the moon, she saw David hand a thick, bulging envelope to the man in the gray trench coat. The stranger began to count the stacks of cash with a slow, methodical greed, then leaned in to whisper something to David. At that moment, David's face transformed. His jaw set into a hard, jagged line, and his eyes narrowed into dark, predatory slits. Allison noticed David's hand move toward the inner pocket of his jacket, where the heavy, unmistakable silhouette of a handgun was visible. She realized then that David wasn't just paying a debt. He was clearing the board, preparing to erase the last remnants of his past, along with anyone who dared to remember it. The following evening, Allison stood before the mirror in her dressing room, the stiff boning of her corset digging into her ribs. The silk of her midnight blue gown rustled with every shallow breath. From the hallway, a series of dry mechanical clicks echoed through the house. David was moving from room to room, engaging the new magnetic deadbolts. She watched his reflection as his fingers danced over a touchpad, entering a new, encrypted access code. The heavy, metallic thud of the front door's lock resonated in her very teeth. David adjusted his cufflinks and threw a clinical look at the security monitor, where every zone indicator glowed a menacing, steady red. He didn't look at her as he signaled that it was time to leave for the gala. Inside the grand ballroom of the Metropole Hotel, the light from a dozen crystal chandeliers was blinding. The air was a thick soup of expensive perfume and the sharp, metallic tang of champagne. Allison took a glass from a passing waiter, but as her fingers brushed the white-gloved hand, she felt a sharp prick. Glued to the bottom of the flute was a scrap of yellowed, brittle paper. She looked up and caught the heavy, leaden gaze of the man in the gray coat, now disguised in a server's uniform. He vanished into the crowd of tuxedos and silk gowns, leaving behind a faint, jarring scent of damp wool and stale tobacco that felt like a rot in the middle of the opulence. Allison retreated into the cramped, marble-lined stall of the ladies' room, her heart hammering. She unfolded the note, the paper smelling faintly of ash. The jagged, desperate handwriting seemed to claw at the page. The message was blunt. Leo would be taken from the house in an hour, unless the full sum was delivered to the designated drop. Allison felt a wave of icy sweat break across her skin, and a bitter, copper taste filled her mouth. The silk-covered walls of the lounge suddenly seemed to be closing in, suffocating her. She pictured David's security team, men he paid to be loyal, standing outside Leo's bedroom door, and her fingers instinctively crushed the note into a tight, jagged ball. On the stage, David stood bathed in the warm glow of a spotlight. His voice, a rich and persuasive baritone, filled the hall as he spoke about the sanctity of the home and the bedrock of American ethics. Allison used the cover of a standing ovation to slip toward the back of the room. She reached the table where David's jacket was draped over a chair. Her heart beat in a frantic, syncopated rhythm. She slid her hand into the deep, silk-lined inner pocket, her fingers closing around the cold, heavy metal of his key fob. As David basked in the adulation of the city's elite, Allison backed away toward the service exit, her movements ghost-like, heading for the darkness of the underground parking garage. The air in the garage was cold and smelled of damp concrete, a shock to her lungs after the ballroom's heat. She pressed the fob, and the black SUV chirped, its lights flashing like a warning. She triggered the tailgate, which groaned open with agonizing slowness. Inside, nestled in the plush carpet, sat a battered nylon gym bag. Allison yanked the zipper back, and the overwhelming scent of fresh ink hit her. Stacks of $100 bills, bound in thick rubber bands, filled the bag to the brim. She shoved her hand deep into the money, her fingers hitting something hard and unyielding. She realized then that this wasn't just a ransom. It was a payload, a sum David had intended to use to buy a permanent silence, one way or another. Beneath the layers of cash, Allison's fingers traced the cold, polymer frame of a Glock. The weapon felt unnaturally heavy, a piece of industrial death hidden in a bag of greed. Beside it lay 2 spare magazines, their brass casings gleaming dully in the overhead fluorescent light. She noticed the safety was already off. This wasn't a kit for a desperate man. It was the equipment of a professional liquidator. Allison remembered the flat, dead look in David's eyes during dinner and understood that Marcus Thorne hadn't just survived. He had flourished. She shoved the gun back under the money, her body shaking so violently she had to lean against the car for support. Her phone buzzed in the darkness, the screen a blinding white square. A message from Leo made her world tilt. He told her he was hiding behind the workbench in the garage. He said he had found a black iron thing with a hole in the glove box of the spare car, and was holding it like they did in the movies. Allison pictured her son's small, soft hands on a hair trigger and felt a wave of nausea. David had turned their entire life into an armory, and now Leo was alone with a loaded weapon, while the shadows of his father's past were closing in on the house. Through the glass doors of the hotel lobby, Allison saw a black SUV scream onto the entrance ramp, its tires smoking. 2 men in low-slung caps vaulted out before the vehicle even stopped. She caught the brief, terrifying glint of a submachine gun barrel poking out from beneath a jacket. The men moved with a terrifying, synchronized speed, heading straight for the Metropole's gilded main entrance. Allison knew the time for negotiation had ended in blood. The ballroom, with its orchids and string quartet, was about to become a kill zone where her husband would be forced to defend his lies with the only language he truly understood. The applause inside began to die down, but David wasn't smiling anymore. From her vantage point by the exit, Allison saw his eyes dart to the empty chair where his jacket had been. His face settled into a ruthless, predatory mask. He touched a finger to a nearly invisible earpiece, his jaw working. He barked a short, silent command, and 2 of his security detail detached themselves from the walls like shadows. David moved toward the exit with the fluid grace of a hunter who had just realized the trap had been sprung. He checked something beneath his cuff as he walked, and Allison knew he wasn't looking for her to save her. He was looking to eliminate a liability. Allison scrambled into the driver's seat and slammed the door, the central locking system engaging with a heavy, final thud. She twisted the key, and the SUV's engine roared to life, a violent, mechanical snarl. Her mind raced through the odd instructions David had given her earlier, the specific route he had insisted they take. She realized she had been nothing more than a high-profile decoy, a splash of silk and diamonds meant to draw the eye while Marcus Thorne set his own snares. Leo in the garage wasn't an accident. He was bait. Allison gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white, her mind made up to shatter the bloody script her husband had written for them. In the rearview mirror, Allison caught a final glimpse of David as he burst onto the hotel steps. The streetlights caught his features, revealing a snarl of pure, unadulterated rage and a thick vein pulsing in his forehead. In that light, there was no trace of the Naperville lawyer left. Marcus Thorne looked directly into the mirror's lens, his eyes dark pits of fury. Allison saw him reach for his waistband, his silhouette jagged against the hotel's gold-leafed entryway. She didn't wait to see what came next. She slammed the vehicle into gear and tore away, leaving the world of Marcus Thorne behind in a cloud of exhaust and burning rubber. The SUV's tires kicked up a violent spray of gravel as Allison slammed the brakes in front of the mansion. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating a scene of wreckage. The heavy oak front door had been hammered off its hinges and hung precariously by a single, twisted metal strap. Inside, the foyer was a void of darkness, save for the frantic, erratic beams of flashlights cutting through the gloom on the second floor. Allison heard the sharp, crystalline sound of glass shattering, followed by the rhythmic, heavy thud of boots on the hardwood. The air that drifted out of the house was thick with the acrid scent of gunpowder and smoke. She vaulted out of the car, the night wind whipping the silk of her gown as she stared into the heart of the house, where the shadows were locked in a violent, chaotic struggle. A heavy, bruising hand clamped onto Allison's shoulder just as she reached the threshold. David lurched out of the darkness, his face a map of jagged scratches and his white dress shirt stained with a spreading, visceral crimson. He didn't speak. He simply yanked the nylon bag from her hands with such force she nearly hit the stone steps. He tore the zipper back, his eyes darting over the stacks of cash. His voice was a guttural, metallic rasp as he shoved her toward the garage, his breath hot and smelling of copper. He commanded her to find Leo and get to the rear exit while he remained in the hall, counting the money and pressing the cold grip of his pistol against his thigh. Allison scrambled into the garage, the air thick with the smell of spilled coolant and old tires. In the far corner, tucked behind the massive oak workbench, she found Leo. His face was a pale mask of terror, his small fingers locked around the heavy steel grip of the Glock. The barrel of the gun wavered, tracing frantic, invisible circles in the air. Allison dropped to her knees, the cold concrete biting into her skin. She whispered his name, her voice a low, steady anchor in the chaos. She reached out slowly, her palm open and non-threatening. Leo let out a broken, shuddering sob, and as her fingers finally closed around the textured slide of the weapon, he let go. She tucked the heavy iron into the folds of her gown, feeling the frantic, rapid-fire beat of his heart against her hand. A sudden, deafening crack of a gunshot tore through the living room, causing the crystal prisms of the chandelier to chime with a frantic, delicate vibration. David dove behind the heavy velvet sofa, the fabric exploding in a cloud of dust and stuffing. Bullets tore into the antique mahogany dresser, sending splinters of wood and fragments of old documents spinning through the air. From her position near the garage door, Allison saw David return fire with a clinical, rhythmic precision. Spent brass casings hit the floor with a rhythmic, metallic clinking, rolling across the polished parquet. The air in the room grew thick and blue with the haze of burnt powder. David's teeth were bared in a primal snarl as a stray round shattered a priceless vase, sending a cloud of white porcelain dust to settle on his hair like ash. The roar of gunfire died away, replaced by a ringing silence and the wet, ragged gasps of the wounded. Allison stood frozen in the doorway, watching as David stepped over the debris toward the man in the gray coat, who lay broken on the Persian rug. The stranger was clawing at his chest, his breath a bubbling, horrific sound. David didn't hesitate. He planted a heavy boot on the man's wrist, pinning him to the floor. His face was a terrifying void of emotion, the cold, calculated mask of Marcus Thorne fully restored. Without a word, David leveled his pistol at the man's forehead. There was a dry, mechanical click, a muffled flash, and the man's body went limp. Allison watched as Marcus Thorne wiped a spray of blood from his cheek with the back of his hand, his eyes never even blinking at the life he had just extinguished. David turned and crossed the room in 3 long strides, his fingers locking onto Allison's wrist like a shackle. He dragged her past the bodies cooling in the foyer, ignoring her frantic attempts to pull away. He hissed that their life was over, that the house and the law practice were nothing but fuel for the fire he had started. He shoved her toward the waiting SUV, promising new identities and a place where no one knew the name Thorne or Merrick. Allison caught her reflection in the side mirror. Her face was a distorted, terrified mask. And she realized with a chilling finality that David wasn't offering a way out. He was inviting her to become a permanent ghost in his machine, to erase Allison Harper Merrick forever. As David turned his back to throw a final bag into the trunk, Allison's hand darted to a hidden panel beneath the SUV's dashboard. Her fingers found the small, recessed toggle of the panic button David had installed himself to protect his assets. She felt a sharp, electric jolt of adrenaline as she flipped the switch. There was no audible alarm, only a faint, internal click. 5 miles away, a red light on a security console began to pulse with the word, "Assault." Allison watched David return to the driver's side, his expression one of frantic, focused survival, completely unaware that a silent signal was already screaming through the wires, dragging the very law he had mocked toward the gates of Naperville Lane. The distant, rising wail of sirens began to cut through the suburban silence. David froze, his head snapping toward the sound, with the panicked intensity of a trapped animal. The realization of what she had done hit him, and he raised a heavy, knotted fist over Allison's head, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unbridled fury. In that split second, Allison lunged, her hand emerging from her gown with Leo's Glock. She jammed the cold, unyielding muzzle directly under David's chin. Her finger took up the slack on the trigger. Marcus Thorne went rigid, the rage in his eyes replaced by a sudden, jarring shock. Allison's heart hammered against the grip of the gun, her gaze locked on his, while the first blue and red flashes began to dance across the tops of the oak trees. A fleet of police cruisers roared onto the property, their spotlights turning the driveway into a stage of blinding white light. Commands barked through a megaphone, amplified and distorted, ordering everyone to drop their weapons. Allison felt the weight of the Glock become unbearable. She slowly opened her hand, and the heavy iron hit the gravel with a dull, final thud. She raised her arms, her silhouette jagged against the glare, feeling the prickle of a dozen laser sights on her skin. David, surrounded by a wall of tactical gear and drawn rifles, slowly sank to his knees. Allison watched as the steel ratchets of handcuffs closed around the wrists of Marcus Thorne. The night was filled with the rhythmic thrum of rotors and the cold, metallic language of an arrest, as the gilded life of the Merricks was systematically dismantled. 6 months later, Allison descended the wide, impersonal stone steps of the county courthouse. A sharp wind whipped the hem of her inexpensive coat, a garment that smelled of detergent rather than perfume. Behind her lay the wood-paneled rooms where she had spent hundreds of hours dismantling the legend of David Merrick with the clinical precision of an executioner. In her bag was the final court order confirming the total seizure of their assets. The mansion, the offshore accounts, and the curated art had all been liquidated to satisfy a mountain of claims. Allison rubbed her face, her skin feeling dry and thin. She had walked away without a single cent of Marcus Thorne's blood money, her pockets as empty as the life she had once envied. She walked toward the bus stop, never once looking back at the grand, indifferent facade of the Hall of Justice. Allison turned the key in the flimsy, protesting lock of her new apartment. The hallway smelled of fried onions and old, damp wallpaper. Inside the single room, illuminated by a bare, flickering bulb, Leo was hunched over a scarred wooden table. He was focused on his homework, his elbows resting on the stained linoleum surface as he carefully traced letters into a notebook. Allison crossed the room and placed a hand on his shoulder, feeling the familiar, comforting texture of cheap cotton. There were no cameras here, no hidden microphones, no velvet-lined traps. Leo looked up and offered a small, genuine smile. In the cramped, quiet space, Allison felt a sudden, overwhelming lightness. For the first time in a decade, the air she breathed felt like it belonged entirely to her. She walked to the window and threw her weight against the frame until it finally groaned open. A thick, urban breeze rushed in, smelling of exhaust and hot asphalt, a sharp contrast to the filtered air of Naperville. Allison closed her eyes and let the wind hit her face. The scent of blue mountain coffee and the feel of cold marble were gone, replaced by the grit of a new, honest reality. She took a long, deep breath, and as she exhaled, she felt the last of the invisible threads Marcus Thorne had woven around her life finally snap. Her hands were steady. She looked out at the sprawling, indifferent city and for the first time saw a future that she didn't have to steal.